Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Joan Young, and I'm the Director of Curatorial Affairs here at the Guggenheim Museum. And I just wanted to welcome you to this evening's program that has been organized as part of the Guggenheim UBS MAP Global Art Initiative. Launched in 2012, this initiative has provided the Guggenheim with a unique platform to strengthen relationships with numerous curators, educators, artists, and colleagues across the globe. Structured to explore contemporary art in 3 regions, South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, and then the Middle East and North Africa. The initiative was developed with an eye towards building on the Guggenheim's distinguished history of internationalism, as well as fostering new scholarship and conceiving a range of educational initiatives within the museum and online. The core of activity has been generated by the 3 curators in residence who are speaking here this evening, who each identified artworks for acquisition by the museum, adding more than 125 works by 85 artists and collectives to the Guggenheim's collection. And they also curated traveling exhibitions using these new acquisitions. Before introducing my esteemed colleagues, I would like to express the gratitude of the Guggenheim Museum to our friends at UBS. MAP has been an ambitious initiative and would not have been possible without their support and collaboration. I would also like to thank the staff of our education and theater departments for their adept coordination of all details of the symposium and evening tonight. The symposium will continue tomorrow afternoon with further discussions with the MAP curators and artists Rashid Arain, Ergin Cavusoglu, Javier Tellez, curator Navhak, and from Public Movement, Dana Yahalomi and Elena Katsov. I hope that you'll be able to join us again. This evening, we will be hearing from the curators about their experiences with the MAP initiative and the approaches they took towards the project. June Yap was our first curator who was involved with the project from 2012 to 2014. She organized the exhibition No Country, Contemporary Art for South and Southeast Asia, which traveled to the Asia Society Hong Kong Center and the NTU Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore, following its presentation at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. June had previously worked at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in Singapore and the Singapore Art Museum, and she's currently organizing the exhibition of Zai Kuning for the Singapore Pavilion at the Venice Biennale next year. As part of the MAP initiative, Pablo Leon de la Barra organized the exhibition Under the Same Sun, Art from Latin America Today, which was on view at the Guggenheim in 2014 before traveling to Museo Jumex in Mexico City and South London Gallery just this past summer. Pablo has organized numerous exhibitions for such museums as Casa Luis Barragan and Museo Tamayo in Mexico City, several institutions in Rio de Janeiro, including the Museum of Modern Art, Casa Franco Brazil, and the Museum Carmen Miranda. He's also worked with the Center for Contemporary Art in Geneva and Kunsthalle Zurich, as well as Apex Art and Art in General in New York. Other recent projects of his include the United States of Latin America, which he co-curated with Jens Hoffman for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit. And also, he served as part of the curatorial teams for Sightlines 2016, New Perspectives on Art of the Americas, which is currently on view in Site Santa Fe through January of 2017. And then Sarah Raza, who organized the 3rd exhibition of the MAP initiative, But a Storm is Blowing from Paradise, Contemporary Art of the Middle East and North Africa, which is currently on view on levels 4 and 5. Sarah has curated exhibitions and projects with artists from West and Central Asia for several international biennials and institutions, including the Tashkent Biennial, Venice Biennial, Art Gallery of Uzbekistan, Maraya Art Center in Sharjah, the Alan Art Space in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and Yurat Contemporary Art Space in Baku, Azerbaijan. I have been continually inspired by the work of my colleagues and would like to thank them all for deepening my knowledge of so many extraordinary artists and artistic practices across the globe. And finally, we are honored to welcome Nancy Spector back to the Guggenheim. Nancy is Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Brooklyn Museum, but of course she previously served as Deputy Director and Jennifer and David Stockman Chief Curator at the Guggenheim. Her numerous award-winning exhibitions at the Guggenheim included Felix Gonzalez Torres, Matthew Barney, The Cremaster Cycle, Richard Prince Spiritual America, Tino Segal, Maurizio Catalan All, and most recently Peter Fishley, David Weiss, How to Work Better. Nancy was instrumental in developing and overseeing all 3 phases of the Guggenheim UBS MAP Global Art Initiative before leaving the museum. And she has been an incredible mentor to me and to many of my colleagues at the museum, and we really look forward to seeing what she accomplishes in Brooklyn. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome my colleagues to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Joan. It's a really lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be back. It hasn't been so long, so it feels very familiar. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here since I was involved from the very, is this not working? Can you hear me? Involved in the beginning of the MAP project from its very inception and worked with my colleagues on conceptualizing its format and helped with hiring each of you. And it's been quite remarkable to now look back over 4 years, I guess, to see all of the quite amazing theoretical and practical work that has taken place. You were each given a very tall order. You were invited to be guest curators and to create a thesis about the art and culture of the region that we determined, rather large regions. We asked you to acquire art for the collection, build an exhibition, write a catalog, and convey that thesis also in the form of a traveling exhibition, working, of course, closely with our education staff with a lot of institutional exchange back into museums in the region. So I would like to hear from each of you about how you went about formulating the thesis that you then used to make your exhibitions. And the only thing I would add is that I noted that each of you really did problematize the concept of geographic specificity. You dealt with that quite intelligently, and that became, I believe, really, if I had to pick one thing that was common to each of your projects, and I would, if you could also kind of respond to why you felt that was necessary. So whoever would like to start.
Okay. Well, thank you for everyone who involved for inviting me back for this symposium, and to Nancy for, well, bringing me on board on this project. I think right from the start, it was quite clear, given that we had different regions that we were assigned, that geography was going to play a part in the project. And there were a few conversations about this, I think, from the start, when before I embarked on the research. But at the same time, having worked at museums before, collection was definitely concerned, but it was also a museum and a collection that, in a way, wasn't my own. Like, for example, when I was working with the Singapore Art Museum, and we looked at collections, there was a very particular approach that one had to take as a curator from that country working in a national museum, right? You had to kind of defend the narrative of nation, or you had to somehow represent it. And what I found coming into the MAP project was that, in a way, it freed me up. I didn't have to play that role anymore. I could actually question certain things that perhaps in a context of my own country's museum, I could not. And that was kind of a starting point for me, looking at a nation and the geography itself. Yeah. But the title No Country actually came to me when I was in Chiang Mai, when I was having a conversation with one of the artists, and that's when it just, well, I've been having these discussions with the artists as to what they thought would be meaningful to have in the collection of the Guggenheim Museum, what they thought within, as well, not so much representing the countries they were from, but just in a more global sort of sense, in a larger sort of way, what was significant to them. And that's when the concept of the exhibition came about. And it took me, I sat on it for a few weeks actually, before I brought it up to Joan, and I think I was in Jogja when that happened, and then after that it was kind of history. Yeah. But that was just to add before I end. I guess in a way what I was looking at was, on the one hand, roots and rootedness. That artists, in a way, we kind of prescribe or we expect them to represent or identify themselves in particular sorts of ways. And as a cultural worker, you're kind of rootless in a way. You're supposed to represent everyone, or it's supposed to be quite mobile and fluid. And for me, that was quite interesting as well to look at. Yeah, and as well as history. Yeah.
Shall I go?
Yes, please.
First of all, I think that we're, having the three of us together for the first time is a really significant thing. To move beyond regional specificity and have three curators, which each one developed and worked very specifically their own target, their own exhibition. Speaking for the first time, it's something, on one hand, incredible for the project, and that hopefully opens up for the kind of transnational, transregional dialogues that are so much needed within the art world. So one, I really celebrate that Sarah had this idea of making this happen, to have the three of us here. And in a way, as a step to moving toward this post-regionalism, no? Which I think was something that all the time we were trying to rethink, that the artists themselves were like, we need to move out of the region. On the other hand, being the Guggenheim, the museum that it is, and a global museum, but also based in New York, and similar to other New York institutions, what we found out is that New York institutions, which seem to be the center, or think of themselves the center of the world, were not really global enough, no? Including the Guggenheim. So opportunities like this project with the support of UBS really allowed the Guggenheim to be global in its mission. No? So on one hand, you do need to use regional specificity to make up for asymmetries existing within collections and programming discourses. So it's a double-edged sword. As June said, the idea of geography was already present even from the beginning. You see the logo, which was already there before we arrived, had the three regions mixed in this kind of Pangea. For those of you that never understood it throughout the project, each of them is supposed to be a country's profile, and they're all mixing together, making this map. So I took the idea of the map in two ways. On one way, to map the Guggenheim's relationship with Latin America. So basically seeing what had the Guggenheim done, what exhibitions had it done, and two, the Guggenheim's collection regarding artists and art from Latin America. And what I found, and maybe this is because Latin America is the southern border of the United States, there had been a relationship that had happened in different moments, and that had been very strong in the 60s, and that then had kind of evacuated and almost disappeared until you did Felix González Torres retrospective in '96, even though Felix resisted to be thought as a Latin American. And then with exhibitions as Brazil Body and Soul or Gabriel Orozco's show. No? So the appearance of the global kind of international artist that moves beyond regional specificity. What I did find also while reading the collection is that while we had in the collection works from the paintings basically up to '66, and again then the global artists from the 1900s, there was this big gap from the '70s and '80s. So I made a big statement of trying, where possible, to incorporate artists from that period into the map project. not only because there was that gap in the collection, but because many of these artists were still producing today. Many of them were active in New York. Many were not. I mean, even though their work is really seminal, didn't have the recognition that they deserve. And they were still influential to the generation of artists working today. So that idea of dialogue for me was really important to bring forward.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Nancy, for being here with us. Thank you very much to UBS for enabling us to be here this afternoon to discuss with you all the very exciting concept of decoupling as discourse. This symposium is something I've been thinking of throughout the entire journey of having curated the exhibition, but also having reflected upon the work of both June and Pablo in terms of the new entities and new discourses that are actually emerging out of the global and what troubles that. If we think about the concept of decoupling, it's something that's moved away from the center without necessarily severing its roots. It becomes its own autonomous entity, if you like. And in terms of my own curatorial work, it was twofold here. One was to build the collection, and the second was to also bring curatorial scholarship forward here. And I was able to marry the two in a very interesting way. I took the Guggenheim's premise of art of our time. I created a very contemporary story, but didn't sever necessarily ideas with history or origins. It was very much rooted in the curatorial program that I was presenting at the institution. Like Pablo mentioned, the issue of transnationalism was very important, as was migration. I was looking at a group of artists who are no longer necessarily living in their homeland. They have dual passports, they have studios in multiple cities. It was becoming a different discourse, really reflecting upon the fluidity of borders. If we think about the Middle East, it's entirely a construct akin to Latin America and South and Southeast Asia. With the exception of Iran and Turkey, the entire region underwent a form of colonial occupation, if you like. So I took this idea of this fragmented jigsaw puzzle where there is this cross-circulation of history, meaning, knowledge that filters through the artworks that are present. So of course there were many challenges in doing this. I was representing a geography, but also looking at the shifting nature of how borders are a little bit more elastic now, ideas are more fluid, and that was also translated into the exhibition.
Thank you all. I just also want to echo, having been here during much of this, that the sponsorship from UBS was really extraordinary. To have the resources to be able to hire all of you for travel, to support living artists at the source. I know that we spent a great deal of time trying to think about acquiring work that was directly from the region to the all extent possible, though of course many artists move around and have galleries elsewhere. But it was unprecedented, and I just think it's important to state that as a model for sponsorship, museum sponsorship. One thing I wanted to ask you, because you bring up the issues of transnationality, which of course is very important, and I think that the regions that we determined could have been carved up differently or maybe more fluid, and if there were another iteration of this, we could think about that. When you talk about nationalism, though, and borders, there is a political dimension that I think came out in all of your work, but of course you're also curators who think along those lines. And I remember in some of the, or at least one of the acquisition committee meetings, there was a question from the Board of Trustees about why are you buying work, only work, that has a political element. It's not purely formal, it's not purely conceptual. There's really something that having to do with contested histories. And is that something that you consciously embraced because that's part of your practice, or was it really something that emerged directly out of the material you were working with and the sites in which you were focused on?
Well, for me, I think artworks that deal with history have always been very interesting for me. So it was kind of natural that the artworks that I recommended had a lot of backstory. But that said, I think I do not think that the works are just simply political. I think they can be presented in many ways. And it's really the curator's role to perhaps to frame and to even change those frames as the work is being presented. So I think, for example, there were a few works that were not presented in the exhibition that we showed and that we toured, but then were shown in other contexts. And as much as, for example, well, one work that I would cite is perhaps Simran Gill's works, Full Moon. And, you know, when in looking at the work in relation to the other works for the exhibition No Country, it could be read quite politically, but it wasn't shown within the exhibition here or when it traveled, and instead was shown in another exhibition which was driven by material aesthetics. And so I mean, on the one hand, I think the works, yes. So it's possible to actually reframe these works or represent these works in other contexts. So, yeah.
I think in my case, the political was very present, and I think it had to do with two reasons. One is the history of Latin America as such, and I think that most of the artists cannot or do not ignore their context, and this in some way or another filters into the work. Sometimes in a form of much more political activism. Let's think Tania Bruguera and really the performance she did in Havana, in the Havana Biennial, where she had a podium where people could speak freely for a minute, something that doesn't happen in Havana, and which got her into a lot of trouble still into today. Yeah. In other cases, although it had a much more aesthetic component, and let's think that was Amalia Pica's work of the geometric figures in which performers do intersections, and really has to do with kind of rethinking the trauma of the past, in this case the dictatorship in Argentina, but also moving forwards and creating new intersections and form of community. So if people don't know the background, I mean, it's just, yes, it looks like a beautiful work, you know, yeah, but it has that, inside, no? I think that for me, and something that became very evident as the exhibition traveled and as we got more used to the works and the exhibition kind of acquired a life of its own, yeah, is that we were not really representing Latin America. What we were doing was representing a way of thinking through art, and that was for me what was really important, and maybe what made the difference, and which is, I think, the great thing that this project brings forward. No, that there's other ways of making art that go beyond merely aesthetics or art about art, or art for the market. No, and I think this is a contribution that I think each one of us, in its own way, brought forward. No, clearly, and really, it's thanks to the artist's works.
Well, to add to Pablo and June, in terms of dealing with the Middle East, it is unavoidable to not consider contested histories or something that populates the daily news in terms of what is happening in that region and what is happening internationally in relationship to that. It was unavoidable. However, rather than give a didactic reading of what we're seeing unfold anyhow in the media, it was very important to find more poetic examples in the exhibition, But a Storm is Blowing from Paradise. A curatorial strategy that I employed was the idea around contraband, looking at ideas around smuggling or conceptual contraband, if you like, where certain artworks concealed further meaning. And that was very important as a curator to offer alternatives. For example, I can give you an example that I used the concept of buffer. Afghanistan was a very interesting point within this exhibition. Firstly, Afghanistan is not in the Middle East. We had two Afghan artists. One was acquired but not shown, Lida Abdul. One was on view, Mariam Ghani, for the first half of the exhibition. And it was very interesting to bring the concept of Afghanistan into the equation of looking at shifting borders, looking at a territory where this country became almost a buffer between the West, between Islam, between different ideologies, and how that role was very active during the Cold War, and how that reprised itself after 9/11. I was very conscious of that, curating a show here in New York where there is a wound here still in terms of its relationship to the Islamic world, and in particular, how Afghanistan played this very interesting role. So here it became kind of ideological strategy, if you like, how the attack on architecture became a metaphor to explore other ideas. And architecture permeates the exhibition, as you'll see when you go upstairs, for those of you who haven't seen it. So there are other strategies that were employed and deployed to some extent within this exhibition. Another was the way in which we actually collected as well. There were several elements in the collecting strategy, for example, to showcase, to continue collecting works by artists of Middle East. that were already in the collection, but to also bring those artists who were filling a void. With the help of Nancy and also my colleague Reem Fader from the Abu Dhabi department, it was essential to bring Emily Jassier, who was the only Hugo Boss Prize winner to never be acquired by the institution, into the collection through the map. Emily's work is not on view because it was a later acquisition in February. There were these underlining strategies that were not necessarily visible to the naked eye that were present, and those of you who can scratch beneath the surface will actually be able to see that. So that was also important.
I know when we discussed the process over time, there was much emphasis on the new. And that was driven, I think, by the original premise of this idea, of this initiative, in that there was a sense of discovery, though we didn't want to use that term, obviously, because of its ethnographic and colonialist inflection. But this notion of contemporary. But I know that each of you kind of struggled to different degrees about the kind of transgenerational. We talked about the transnational, but influence was very important. Homage was very important. I know Pablo spoke already about wanting to recuperate a history of Latin American artists who had really been very influential in New York for conceptual art. But in retrospect, is this something that you would have liked to delve into maybe a bit more profoundly in terms of the acquisitions that you made and the way that you structured your exhibitions?
Shall we start from the other end?
Of course, however.
Over to you.
Well, obviously the timing did play a huge impact, and it's been a very short lead time. But I would like to say that sometimes that is also a positive as well. Given such a short period, it kind of forces you to be more impulsive. But in terms of building a collection, impulsion is one thing, but also there is the importance of the legacy or the question of what you will leave behind. I mean, in my case, it was important to, although it was a contemporary story, as I mentioned, all the artists present within the exhibition are all contemporary living artists who have generated this narrative. It was also important to look back a little bit. Architecture, as I mentioned, became an interesting metaphor. I mean, I was able to bring elements in from the history of the architect of this building, Frank Lloyd Wright, his engagements in Iraq from going back as the 50s, and bring some of these elements. So site specificity became interesting. Where I wasn't able to fully engage in bringing in the collection, more collection works, I was able to engage with the building. I was able to interrogate some of the histories that were present. So that was something that I was able to fulfill. But however, if I had more time, of course, there would have been certain more artists, but I hope that this is a continuing story. By purchasing works by Ori Gerst and Joanna Hadji-Thomas and Khalil Jarraj, who were already in the collection, that showcased a commitment. It showed the institution to continue buying. So therefore, the seeds were sown in that respect. But of course, there would have been more of a historical legacy as well. But this wasn't necessarily a canon building exercise for me, personally.
I talked a little bit already about how I incorporated artists of previous generations, but I think, as I said, this has to do with the double challenge we faced. On one hand, the responsibility of bringing works into a collection where they will live and coexist forever with the rest of the artists and works, so really from studying that collection, but other that we had to do an exhibition that was coherent on itself, on its thesis, and in which works related with each other. Of course, time had to do. We had only each one about 6 months really to bring up an artist list and acquire
Rather
works
extraordinary.
in order for them to be ready in a year's time. No? So I think in a way each one of us brought their experience. So although it seemed that it was 6 months or a year, it was really 15 years of work or 10 years of work, 12 years of work of each one, in order to make sure that these different pieces came together in the puzzle. Of course, then you face things as, maybe some artists that you wanted, there was no work available, others were beyond our budget. So within that, you try to kind of bring the puzzle together. The other thing I wanted to mention that was interesting was that, because we had to bring in works that already existed into the collection. So there was, we couldn't bring works that were not done or commissions. But through the project, we could commission a public program and different projects, and that really kind of also made the difference and brought a live element. I'm just going to mention one case, but that was Alfredo Jar's work, A Logo for America. For me, it was, or it has always been a super important work on my own history of understanding art itself. No? And I remember when I came for the interview, I showed two works. One was Alfredo Jar's Logo for America. The other one was Mario Garcia Torres' dialogue with Dr. Atol about a possible Guggenheim in Guadalajara. And I said, if they go with these works, I think we'll be fine in doing things. What I didn't know is that the whole history of what would happen with Alfredo Jar's or with us acquiring the work and being able to reactivate it in Times Square. And this really came from a dialogue with you, Nancy, and that really, I think, for me, was part of the learning. No? Nancy said, yeah, it's great that we acquired that documentation, but what if we acquire the possibility of reactivating this work again? No? And at the time, it sounded almost like something impossible, and actually, it was something that we were able to do and have it again happen in Times Square during a month during the exhibition. We had it happen in Mexico, and then in London in Piccadilly Circus during 5 days. So it was really bringing a work back to life through the project. So it was not only a work of the past, but it was a work that's still alive and that's still resonant. And that in Mexico, it really dealt with issues of the border and with the Republican candidate starting to speak about building this wall. If you know Alfredo Jar's work, the map of the USA appears and says, this is not America, this is not the flag of America, this is not the map of America, and the whole map of the American continent appears and it says, this is not America, and it was an advertisement screened in Times Square in 1987. So we reactivated this work again. And again, it was not as an old work, as a document, but really as a work that continues to resonate. When we did it in England, in Piccadilly Square, I mean, we had planned to do it, but it was 2 weeks after Brexit. So again, started resonating these issues about borders, about nationality, and it became more relevant than ever. No? So it's also this thing that the past continues speaking and having echoes today.
I think even though I mentioned at the beginning that it was kind of freeing to be doing a project like this with the Guggenheim and its collection, in that as curators coming from elsewhere, you have the liberty of deciding, what sorts of works, and you're quite unconstrained in that sense, given that the collection was in a way quite objective, or had we had a bit of distance between ourselves and the collection itself. So that's it. I think curatorially there's inevitably a need or desire for completeness. And so in the process, you're looking at a few artists from different generations, you're looking at artworks with different materials, and which, I don't know, I mean, I think it's good, there is a range, and I think it also helped with trying to justify bringing these works into a collection, that it wasn't limited to just say one particular type of work from the region and ignoring and excluding other works. But at the same time, as a result, there are certain limits as well to what works were brought in, because we were looking at a variety and could only do so much in some sense. The other thing is, as Pablo mentioned, even though we had a short period of time to work in, we come with years of experience, and I think it's very much that's what you see in the project is our accumulated experiences with different artists and different exhibitions, and then suddenly having to compress all that and accelerate and have this project done very quickly. That's it. I think the project has been very good for quite a few artists, especially from Southeast Asia. That's not so visible most of the time on an international level. So for artists such as, say, Vendi Ratana or Chung Tan, from Vietnam. This was a wonderful platform, and I think that it helped a lot for artists like this who have been critical, have been doing so much over the years to be recognized in such a way. Yeah, so that was good in as much as, again, it was limited how many artists and artworks we could bring in. Yeah.
So I think a difficult question probably because it's very subjective, but all of you have worked deeply and profoundly in the regions in which you were then assigned. And of course, even though we speak about being, I still say we, the Guggenheim speaks about being a global institution. It's still rooted here in the United States. It has partners in Europe. So I think that the ethos here is Eurocentric, Anglo-Saxon, however you want to look at it. Did you find, and this is not tell-all, but did you find that there were moments of friction where just simply there was a lack of understanding on our side in terms of the aesthetics, your goals, or I'm just curious now in retrospect, I certainly can kind of think of difficult moments when we were hashing out how we would move through this effectively. And if there's anything you would like to discuss or
Well, I'll bring
contemplate.
up one example very, very quickly. Actually, I was kind of surprised at the things that the museum would say yes to. Well, some of them. For example, Wendy Ratner's work, Vom Ponds. And it's a work that looks at the numerous tons of bombs that the US had dropped in Cambodia between 1965 and 1974. And I mean, it's really obvious what the work is critiquing. And the museum was extremely excited to get it. I was a bit, it surprised me a little.
Well,
Yes.
I think
I had offered another work as well, which actually was a critique on French colonialism, and that was like, apparently not quite so interesting as American past. Yeah.
I think the institution at the time and continues to be self-reflexive and to reflect that in a
Yeah.
broader
So
cultural
that was pretty
context.
good.
So yes.
Yes.
And you don't all have to answer each question, so if you don't
Yes.
want to divulge, you don't need to. But
Just a short commentary in terms of you were saying about the Eurocentric qualities of the collection that exists that are inherent almost, that's inherent in all Western museums, but America's proximity to the Middle East, for example, lesser exposure, more of a military colonialism, if you like, or rather an economic one relationship, whereas in relationship to Latin America, it was more of a physical one, and in some cases in Southeast Asia also, obviously Vietnam being one of the most potent examples. So with the Middle East, once again, it was this kind of military presence, but lesser understanding of the contemporary practices, other than those that are readily available in the Biennale circuit, for example. There was a little bit of that. There was also a bit of a dichotomy between artists who live in the diaspora and those who live in the so-called region itself, that how authentic is that practice? But then again,
it's a debate, an important debate we had.
An important one for sure in terms of how they're relating to the region. But given the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, so many artists are living abroad, studying abroad, and even the way in which the Whitney, for example, has started to readdress how it defines American art, artists who are, for example, from Kuwait, born in America, then left, have spent their entire education, childhood living in Kuwait, for example, are still defined as American. So it was a way in which also to redefine
And vice
that.
versa.
Exactly, absolutely.
I think for me, what was really impressive was, the total respect we had, or the museum had towards our work. There was always discussion, and I think that was productive, especially with you, but also with Richard, our director, and other members of the curatorial. And there was always an absolute respect. No, even I would say even from UBS, we presented the works to UBS. They were there listening to our presentation. They never censored anything. So really, I think that was a position that I admire. We could say, for example, Mario Garcia's work, in which he really deals critically with the Guggenheim's history of expansionism. and in which the museum self-critically accepted. And for me, it was really important that the museum could have this work as a way of kind of reflection on its own global position or understanding of globalization, something which this project really tried to change, how the Guggenheim dealt with the world, that it's not only about building museums elsewhere, but about engaging differently with other institutions, other art communities, artists, curators, publics, and it's something that we've been doing with exhibition traveling, but also by inviting other thinkers, scholars to participate through the website, through seminars, so really kind of changing or rethinking this model, which I don't think it was the Guggenheim model. It was a U.S.-American model of operating, a global model of landing in the world. And I think today, if we want the world to continue existing, we need to change many ways of operating, and I think this is part of it.
I'm glad you brought that up because that really does dovetail with the last question I want to ask you. And now that the project is coming to its sort of logical end to the extent, I know, Sarah, your show is still destined to travel. Is your exhibition still in London or South London?
It finished a week ago. Yeah.
The notion of legacy and impact is very important in a project like this, but in many such initiatives that they do here. And I'm curious just if you have some insight and suggestions how the Guggenheim can continue the important dialogues that were started with the artists in the region, the various institutions that you worked with for the traveling exhibitions, for, as you say, for guest speakers, thinkers, bloggers. How to sustain that, and as the world continues to change, keeping those networks solid, robust, but also flexible enough that the Guggenheim's collection can continue to grow, its exhibition programming can be perhaps influenced by the work you've started. And I'm wondering if you have any advice to the museum.
I mean, none of this would have been possible without the UBS initiatives. So such initiatives are essential. I mean, it's a historical impact for sure. The works that have entered the collection are never going to expire. Will expire, but the works will never expire. So that's really essential to continue these models of philanthropy that continue to support artists. I mean, I was able to buy more work from artists already in the collection. I reiterate that through the MAP initiative, which wouldn't have been made possible ordinarily. So such initiatives are so essential in terms of furthering our global reach, but also bringing in works that are from international discourse, but create a local dialogue, a dialogue with the works that are already existing within the collection. That's important. But also ways in which we can further and strengthen our relationships with the artists and also some of the thinkers that have been extended via the MAP microsite, theorists, thinkers, curators. The kind of wider network, so to speak, must continue.
Yeah, like Sarah said, pretty much. I think when we joined the project, and I think for all of us, I'm kind of speaking for all of us, that for each work that we introduced, we were already thinking about its future. I think it's very, well, something quite inevitable for us as curators, that you're thinking about, what the work can do, or its legacy after that. But what I think might be interesting as well is for these works to be curated by other individuals in other sorts of ways. So not just, at least for the works that I've brought in, not just reading it from the perspective that I brought in, with the work to the collection, not just from that particular viewpoint, but for the work to be viewed by other curators, other intellectuals, other academics, and be presented in other ways, spoken about in different ways as well. I mean, and the same can be said about all the works actually in the collection, right, that were there before we came in. That for me would be quite interesting. I'd like to hear someone else's view of some of the works that I've brought in.
And that has already begun, and it's been very
Yes.
exciting to see works that have been requested for loan elsewhere, and works, as you brought up, with the Simran Gill that have been incorporated into other exhibitions, which create entirely different contexts, which makes for a more living, textured collection.
Yes, Yeah.
We've seen that a number of works in the map shows have been requested by institutions, such as far as in the MCA in Australia, also the Studio Museum Harlem as well. So it's great that it's both local, but it's also further afield as well. So there is going to be more interest in these works, I hope, as well. More visibility, more power to the artists. It's very important.
I guess a question we've always had is, I mean, how to give continuity to these projects, how not to make them a one-night stand with other geographies, how to continue engaging in different ways. No, so I think, I mean, that's part of the homework of the institution, and which hopefully I think projects like this, and we've talked a lot about it internally also, in a way do change the DNA of the exhibition. No? It makes the people inside the institution think also differently. No? Like it kind of opens up the perspectives, and I guess this is part of what we did as part of the project. No, I think also, I mean, what's interesting is to continue having this kind of dialogues, not to move out of regions, to reconsider also, I mean, what other past histories have been written where this kind of transnational, transregional dialogues have existed, in which artists it had happened, or which other parallels are there. So I think there's still lots of work to be done in order to correct what I call these asymmetries. No, but I think this is an incredible start.
Yeah, and if I can speak momentarily for my former curatorial colleagues, and I would imagine all of the individuals in the education department that were involved in the exchanges with the various institutions in the region, that it was an enormously gratifying educational experience, and I think that you've fundamentally changed the way the museum thinks, and certainly the collection, the contemporary collection, is a very different tenor. So thank you for that.
I want to say one thing, and it's, I mean, yeah, it's great that we did this. It's great we curated the show. It's great that we brought all these artists, but we couldn't have done it, one, I mean, if it wasn't because of the artists of the work, but the other, the Guggenheim's team was amazing, like really having this whole machinery standing behind one and helping you think, produce, make things happen, and in really such a professional way. It's really kind of the invisible kind of mechanism that you don't see. And really,
well,
I mean, from education department,
outsider, I can second that. It's pretty extraordinary, the infrastructure here and the talent, and the belief. There's a lot of belief in the power of well, art from all eras, but you know, and a willingness to execute. So yes, I see that more clearly now. Would anybody like to ask questions?
I have a question for June and Pablo. As I have yet to experience my exhibition touring internationally, because it's still on view here in New York, I would like to know, in terms of your relationship with the host institutions, the institutions where your exhibition went to, for example, yours in Hong Kong and Singapore, and Pablo, yours in Jumex in Mexico City, and then in London. How do you envision continuing to work with those, if at all? Do you see that relationship has been cemented in some ways, that you will be continuing to elaborate with those institutions, with those relationships? I know that Fischli and Weiss went to Jumex, for example, but that was already decided, but...
Coincidence.
Where did you start?
Coincidence, oh, I see, good. A lucky
I mean, more than that, I think there were two totally different experiences. One with Museo Jumex in Mexico City, which is, let's say, Mexico's newest museum for contemporary art. It's a private museum started by a very dedicated collector there, and which in a way had a history similar to the Guggenheim, no? Started by a private collector, becoming a public museum. So I think on one hand there was a lot of learning that they could get from us, but I think what you really learn is that the learning process goes in both directions. I think something we haven't talked a lot about here is really the kind of and Nancy mentioned it a little bit, the hidden side of the project, which really has to do with education, public program, all the kind of, which goes from the internet web platforms, but really to engagement with the educators from the different departments, the education team from New York, went to Mexico. The team from Mexico went to New York. The team from London, they all went to Mexico. So really creating, again, three connections.
Three-way dialogue.
Yeah, three-way dialogues, which were really incredible. In the terms with South London Gallery, South London Gallery is a really small institution in the south of London, so it was a totally different.
I start my career there.
They depend partly government funding. The rest they really have to raise it up. It's small in scale, but it's been existing for 150 years, and it was made for the people, no, really for the workers to go and experiment art. So a totally different situation. Where there it was really also the Guggenheim, who we really learned about their commitment to their own local community, to their own kind of public programs. And part of the legacy is that we could work with them and through the project's funding to be the first ones to use this new space that they had been donated. So part of the legacy of the project is that we put funds to make that space ready for, or part of it ready for the exhibition, and two, that we worked locally with their different groups. No, so I think that each one had its own learning process, not only for them but from us. No? So again, I think those kind of dialogues are the ones that made the project interesting.
Thank you.
I think there was a bit of a challenge bringing the show back to Asia, and it was something also that I had considered right from the start, when we were already looking at the selection of works and how it's going to be presented here and the exhibition title. The fact that when the works are presented here, they would seem quite new, quite fresh, sometimes, and the artists may not be known to the audience here or to the international audience that comes to the Guggenheim, given that, for example, Southeast Asia's artists are not so visible. But as it moved back to Southeast Asia, Hong Kong and Singapore, the fact is that these artists are known in the region. Some of these works have been seen before. So then how do we make this presentation meaningful? And for me, it was really about trying to reframe the issues of the exhibition and its overall concerns, so that it became, so we could highlight what was important for each of these spaces. Mm-hmm. So actually, in some way, the curatorial framing changed along the way, and that was planned as well. The way we approached it, the way we presented it to our audiences was slightly different. That's it. I think as the exhibition toured, it also became a bit about building a relationship between institutions. So, for example, the Guggenheim with the CCA, Guggenheim with Asia Society. So in that way, it exceeded the artworks themselves. Now it was about the people.
That was intrinsic to the initial concept, that it really would be this ever reverberating outward network that, back to the question of impact and legacy, how to sustain that, those lines of communication. And I think that obviously that remains to be seen how that happens, but I think the will is there.
Yeah, I guess it's as you said, it's reverberations, which means you try and make an impact, and you can't really control these ripples. They happen, but if you kind of made you hope that you made the right impact at the right point with the right, material, equipment, and that
I found
it works
fascinating
in some way.
Throughout this, and a couple of you mentioned this diasporic aspect, because I know when we were originally talking about the project, we were very orthodox about the artists needed to live in the region, they needed to be rooted, and it just didn't bear fruit in the sense that we were so limiting ourselves and not recognizing the fact that artists were moving not just out of the region, but from, if you were looking at how many artists were from Peru versus Uruguay versus Mexico, that it just was a false way of accounting. And then, of course, there's artists in New York, which is a cosmopolitan city, or Paris or London. And then beyond that, you also had artists who were living in the region who had representation in galleries in Europe. So that original premise had to change. And I just found that was very interesting. I think it just was a reflection of the realities of how artists are living and working today. Do you have a question?
So I'm somewhere extending a comment. Which will
Maybe
be
introduce yourself so people know who
I'm
you are.
Sumesh. Yes. So I'm extending one of Pablo's comments and one of your comments, which might emerge as a question. And it's about comparisons of reading exhibition histories of the recent Global South and the non-aligned movement, because the non-aligned movement was replaced by the idea of the Global South as a kind of political entity in the kind of redundancy of this non-aligned status. And I think when we talk about the decoupling, we must also imagine that we inhabit some forced coupling, such as the definition of South Asia, where an artist in South Asia could come from the south of India and find cultural, political, and many other affinities with Latin America and Africa, rather than find any kind of affinity with Delhi. And then the diaspora creates a certain kind of global south that happened in Paris in the 60s or in New York after the 60s. And I really liked what you talked about, the idea of Latin America not being talking of a region, and then you talked about Alfred Hujar. And so for my question is about when we are decoupling the discourse, we have to decouple these geographical microcosms of the global south. For example, if you're a Tunisian artist, you cannot travel to Dubai to show an exhibition because you cannot travel, you would not get a visa. And so you do not have any relationship with the Middle East while you're in North Africa. Or Algeria produced a lot of amazing art between Mexico and India and other places, because Algeria was where Frantz Fanon and Iqbal Ahmed was present, and today you have Rachid Arain who's sitting there. And so did you all find the challenge of from being part of the Black Arts movement, suddenly we find ourselves as South Asian artists or Latin American artists, or finally global South artists in that sense? And somewhere, if you all could expand on that, these kind of dichotomies, and that comes from this kind of regionalism where we have the global South and then we have smaller microcosms, and how they work against each other, and they need to be decoupled also. Yeah.
Well, absolutely, there's like a constellation, if you like, what you're saying. But I always think of the example during the Cold War, when there was a huge proportion of artists from Central Asia, from Africa, from the Arab world, that were looking to Russia, for example. They weren't looking to the West. Their view was focused there. So in terms of art histories emerging, they were very much rooted in this kind of socialist history, but also through migrations as well, as you mentioned, migration of people, but also how ideas also filter. So you have these reverse patterns as well. So it's very interesting that you raised that example. An artist could have more in relationship to, for example, the writing of Fanon or his interests in North African discourse rather than what's happening actually in Delhi. For sure, there are these reversals, and that's a lot to do with the way in which the world was structured as well. Up until like after 1991, or if you like just earlier, 1989, the world really shifted at that point as well. There became a kind of prohibited travel, but also a freedom for others as well. So it's all to do with this shifting terrain as well.
I think we're also very honored to have tomorrow Rashid Arim, who's sitting here in the front row, and he should have been the keynote, no? Because I think a lot of what you were saying and a lot of this experience is already there through his thinking and through his practice. So.
Yeah, I think in the process of doing this project, there were definitely moments when you're really trying to attenuate, some of the asymmetries that are inherently there, or that are assumed as well. But the other thing that was important for me was also not imposing certain readings on the artworks. To have a frame that was broad enough too, and to not over-interpret the artworks in some sense, or to impose meanings that may not already be there, so as to create certain discourses, in as much as there were certain works where their critique, where their positions were very clear. But I think as an exhibition, it's really trying to tease out these issues, these questions, and to allow the audiences to also explore them while looking at the work. So yeah, I understand, the desire to have very strong discourse, in a way, within the exhibition, but at the same time, I think the works themselves sometimes do that on our behalf as curators. Yeah.
Hello, and thank you. My name is Lori. I wanted to ask a fun question. Say, in a scenario where there was a lot more funding coming in, and you could pass the baton to a colleague in another region of the world, where should resources be put to kind of dig up another layer of cultures that may be relatively unknown to Americans or the Guggenheim system?
That's a great question, because I know that that's something being pondered here.
In the Latin American research, we tried to push it away from the obvious countries. So this means that even within the continent or the subcontinent, there's black holes of which we know less, and countries of which we know less, and artistic practices of which we know less. No? So part of what I was able to do was really to try to push myself to go to those places of which I have less knowledge, but also of where we as an artistic society have less knowledge. That was part of the process, and it's, I mean, that would be, for me, part of the thinking, no? How to go to those places, not only in Latin America, but in the regions and the rest of the world, of which we know less, and where we can articulate new dialogues. Another of these regions in Latin America itself was the Caribbean, no? Which in a way is such a microcosms of different languages, cultures, and even of which themselves know so little about each other. No? So, I mean, Africa, of course, is there. So, I mean, on one hand, yes, I understand your question in terms of geography, but I think, again, we should think it in a post-geographical way, no? Whatever it is. No?
Yes. It's always interesting to think about the Middle East, because nobody from the Middle East actually ever says, I'm from the Middle East. They say, I'm Egyptian, I'm Persian, I'm this, I'm that, I'm from the Levant. But no one from living there will ever say, I live in the Middle East, or identify with that. Exactly, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Sophia, and thank you so much for this really enlightening talk. I've been tangentially part of this project, which I think is extremely important, and I very, very much hope to see it continued. But I have a number of interrelated questions. So you three have worked very separately in the Guggenheim, kind of overlapping only for brief periods of time. And I was just wondering how, as part of the Global South team, how do you see your separate regions interconnect? How have your artists interconnected? Where are those gray areas? And the other question I had is about something that Sarah said, which I thought was very interesting, which is that you said we are not canon building. So I wanted maybe you to expand a little bit upon that. So, because of course this is an anti-canonical project as a whole, but at the same time, it is perhaps building a new kind of canon. And how is that? How are you imagining that unfolding? And and the other part is about who you left out in this sort of web of alliances, and how you feel about that, and how you hope to continue in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Sophia was a Hillary Bay Fellow, and I gave her a task to work on a timeline of events, chronological timeline. It was one of her tasks. It was very interesting that you brought up the question about the canon. Well, I had a theme, and not everyone can really fit within that thematic. I had a thematic construct for this exhibition. It wasn't rooted in necessarily trying to fill holes or showcase this historical timeline, so to speak. It was rooted more in my own interest. One of the great things about this project was that I was given freedom to bring my own curatorial interests, my own scholarship, my own research in sciences, in mathematics, in logic, in architecture, here to the institution. That was very important. Although I did marry that with, obviously, the three elements, the ethos of this institution: art of our time, non-objective painting, and art of abstraction. So that was a starting point to kind of bring this dialogue, to focus on this contemporary story. Had it been a canonical project, it would have been years in the making, given the parameters of what MAP was requiring. It was really for me to work within a contemporary framework, which is a language that I am trained to speak about, that I am able to. But then again, as I mentioned, that there was the artists that I selected, they didn't necessarily sever the past. They were actively engaging with the past, actively engaging with history, actively engaging with the formation of modernism, right down to the artists that are present, but also public movement, who've been engaging in kind of the corporal language response to the exhibition. So there were other arms or other ways that the canon was maybe like interrogated a little bit, if you like. It's not something that I'm through with altogether. It has appeared and reappeared in different ways. I hope that answers your question.
You don't have to, each of you don't have to each answer.
Who we left out? We left out many. But
I remember the list.
a huge list.
Many.
But also you learn that, the problem is that projects like this create big expectation of artists in their region that they're going to be represented, that everybody's going to be included. And because projects like this happen every 5 years, every 10 years, once in a decade, in which different institutions engage in doing that Latin American exhibition. I think every day less, but still it's something that's present in a kind of history. So again, yes, I try to do a history of okay, how has Latin America been represented, and how are we going to rethink it today? Someone that I really wanted to incorporate in some way, and I didn't. It's an honorary Latin American. I try to include him every time I can in an exhibition, and that's David Medalla from Philippines. And he really exemplifies the transnational artist, someone that almost maybe doesn't even have a passport today, that moves around the world. But he was so important in showing for the first time, at least in London, and giving them visibility because of that. International through Signals magazines and Signal Space, Elio Tisica, Lydia Clark, Sergio Camargo, and many other artists. But still today continues producing, rethinking, and so maybe we should have invited him to do a performance or to do something.
June wanted to include him also, right? If I recall.
But you can see his work right now in Singapore.
Yeah?
It's actually been acquired by the National Gallery.
Good.
So, yes. I was just thinking about the question of who we left out. And yeah, we definitely could not incorporate very many artists in this project. But then again, I think there's no possibility that we could have completeness in that sense. Yeah. But as for the question of canon, I think on the one hand, I was definitely trying to raise the issue of the assumptions of canon building for the countries themselves, in the sense of how they would represent or be expected to represent themselves. But as you had indicated, even so, by putting the works together, we do somehow constitute a canon of some sort. And so for me, it was important that the process was one that was that there was a dialogue, there was an exchange, and that's why the rest of the title for No Country was Contemporary Art for South and Southeast Asia. The word "for" being an attempt to engage and to have that dialogue, to be a reciprocal sort of relationship, rather than of one observing the other or of one submitting to the other. So that was one small way in which I was trying to frame it, such that we could perhaps, given that it was art, have this conversation in an even kind of platform. Yeah. Even if the outcomes might not be entirely equal in the end, but at least we start off that way. Yeah.
Interestingly, just listening to and thinking about that question, when we're dealing with very contemporary art, unfortunately the canon is often the market. Mm-hmm. And I think that having witnessed the process for each of you, that was really never a consideration. And it was very refreshing. But it's a good question. And then I think we all have to contemplate the idea of, now that the museum has acquired this work, are we formulating inadvertently a canon but that remains to be seen. So I think we'll stop there. Thank you all so much.